Hey, today I'm going to give a presentation that I gave at the San Francisco Ruby meetup just a few days ago in November. If you live in the Bay Area, you should check it out. The presentation I gave was about Sitepress. And if you go to the sitepress.cc website, this is the tagline you'll see on it. As I get deeper into this, you'll see there's actually a lot more to it. But for now, this is what I tell everybody, and we'll get into why. Before that, though, it's important to know what is Sitepress, but more importantly, why did I build it? What were my motivations for it? So a long time ago, back in 2015, I was building static websites, and I found Middleman, which was great. I could take a folder of ERB files, Markdown, what have you, run a compiler on it, and on the other side, there'd be a bunch of HTML files that I could just upload to something like S3. And then I'd have a website. So Middleman had a lot of really great things going on. It still does. They had some really good APIs. And then the problem I ran into, though, I needed to get something like Middleman running inside of Rails. So I actually tried to drop Middleman into Rails, and I just ran into all these issues with the dependencies. You can see these dependencies being highlighted on the screen. It's fine, maybe if you drop it into Rails 5, but then when it's time to upgrade to Rails 6, it didn't like it. There was so many gems in this thing. I just couldn't get it working, and I couldn't quite find dependencies that could get Middleman running inside of Rails. So looking for a quick painkiller, I turned to Jekyll, which is another very popular static site generator built in Ruby, to see maybe that would solve my problem. I could just drop that into Rails, but it actually had the same issues. There were just all sorts of dependencies Rails had, and I just couldn't get it working. So what did I do? I started building Sitepress, and I called it Middleman and Rails. That's kind of how the thing started out. That's my daughter. She's now 8 years old. I think she's 1 in that picture. And that's actually a screenshot of when I started writing Sitepress code. So I started writing this back in 2016, which means that Sitepress is over 8 years old. It's really close to 9 years old. And that means it's finally getting good. I actually think good software takes like a decade to get really, really good. All right, so as I said before, it's kind of starting out, Sitepress can actually do a lot more than just be a really great way to build content websites in Rails. You can generate static websites. You can embed it in Rails, or both, or all sorts of things. So this is a picture of, I guess, a piece of cake having itself and eating it too. So you can have your cake and eat it too. And apparently, like when cake does that, it wants to have a glass of wine with it. Fun times. All right, so if you want to use Sitepress as a static site generator, you'd run gem install Sitepress, and then you run the Sitepress CLI command, Sitepress new, just give it the name of your website, and then you cd into my site, and then you kick off the server. So Sitepress server, that boots a development server, and if you open the port, I think it's 8080, then you'll see your website. And then, of course, once you're done building your website, developing it, you can run Sitepress compile, and then you'll get a bunch of static HTML files that you can deploy to AWS or Netlify or your own VPS, wherever. The other way is you can use Sitepress as a Rails engine. So bundle add Sitepress Rails, you add that to your Rails project, or you run that from your Rails project root. And then when you're in Rails, you type in Rails generate Sitepress install, and that will create an app content directory, which I'm going to demo in a few slides with some real code. So you'll get a taste of how that works. And then I've actually started doing this more recently, where I'll run gem install Sitepress, create the new site, and then I actually just use Sitepress server. So that's not only a development server, but you can also run it in production. The interesting thing about running Sitepress server in production is it's actually this teeny tiny Rails server. So if you cracked open the source code of Sitepress server, you can see on line 11 in this code that it's inheriting from Rails application. The important thing too is if you look at lines 1 and 3 here, there's just a really small number of dependencies for Rails. All I depend on is action controller railtie, which pulls in action view and action controller. It does use sprockets still. I probably need to switch that over to prop shaft. And then it requires Sitepress Rails. Now, granted, Rails does have quite a few dependencies, so it's not entirely dependency free. There's still a lot that it pulls in, but it just works really well with Rails. And one benefit that I learned kind of on accident is that as Rails improves, Sitepress improves. I don't have to worry about managing a lot of the web infrastructure underneath it. It just works, and I benefit from a ton of what the Rails community does. All right, so there are a lot of websites using Sitepress. Whenever I started using it, it was for pull everywhere. There's content files all over this Rails application, and I used Sitepress to kind of contain all that and get it into one place. During my time at Fly.io, a project I did there is I actually migrated their documentation website from Middleman to Sitepress. They had like 10-minute build times in Middleman, and needed to get that down because if you fix a typo, it gets thrown into a CI queue. It takes 10 minutes. It starts to add up. So I set a goal, if I can compile thousands of pages of documentation in 60 seconds, it'd be awesome. And it turned out to be closer to 30 seconds. So I was quite pleased with how that turned out. And then, of course, these other websites, Hotwire and Pushpad, those all use Sitepress as well. And there's actually quite a few more. I think I've offered to put some other logos on here, but I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But I want to talk about a project that I've been working on recently because I've been deep into building the documentation for TerminalWire. So a quick refresher on TerminalWire is just a way to stream the command line from a Rails server over WebSockets to like a thin CLI client that a developer installs. It makes building CLI applications 10 to 100 times easier. And since you're probably a Rails dev watching this, you can think of it as like Hotwired, but for command line applications. So you can build them and ship them, and you don't need an API. It's just streaming standard I/O over WebSockets. All right. So, of course, since I created Sitepress, I always bring it into projects and I kind of start pushing the limits on it and playing around with certain ideas that I have. That's really kind of how I develop software, is I use it in production, learn from it, and then roll back into the repos. So with that, let's get into a demo. Here's the checklist. When I presented on a few days ago, I actually forgot the Markdown one, which I think is quite interesting. So I'm going to jump out of this and let's get into what the documentation looks like. Okay, so I have on my localhost for TerminalWire this manuals page. So I'm kind of going old school TerminalWire, just like it's a throwback to the days whenever you actually ran your own software. TerminalWire is software that you install on your server. Maybe I'll keep it, maybe I won't. But think of manuals as docs and licensing as pricing. All right, so let's check out the Ruby on Rails docs. You can see we had this cover, and whenever we click on it, it kind of looks like a book. This content here is generated in Markdown. And then we can see we have chapters over here. The things I'm highlighting now, I'm going to kind of show you how it all comes together. So we have chapters. You can see we have the book cover there again. We have some more content. And then, of course, since we have chapters, we need to have next chapter and previous chapter. So this kind of gives you an idea of what the end product looks like. Now let's see how I use Sitepress to build it. And let's look at some code. All right, so as I was saying, TerminalWire is a Rails application. This application handles documentation and licensing, and also it handles payment processing. So for the content, I need to have documentation on there. And when I ran TerminalWire install, it creates the content folder. So if you look at that, we can see there's pages in the content folder. And the docs that we were looking at, we were at docs/Rails. And let's see this side by side with the content here. Okay, so we're going to go back to the cover. And actually, I'll just jump there to the URL, and we'll kind of see how these line up, right? So we have the title here, Ruby on Rails manual, Ruby on Rails. We have a subtitle, which you would see on the cover right there. And of course, we have the cover here. So what's kind of cool about this is if I change this to say pink, and then I save it, everything is going to be updated. let's say people don't identify with Ruby on Rails and they want to call it Rails. So you can see how all these different parts of the web page updated. We can reorder these chapters and do all sorts of fun things like that. So this is kind of the benefit of Sitepress, is that you get to treat your content as data. And that's ends up being a really powerful thing, but kind of how all this flows out, it does require a bit of thinking about architecture. And again, we're starting with our Rails page here. So let's look at the chapters. We do know that like the first chapter getting started is chapter 1. So if we look over here, you'll notice that a file system usually sorts alphabetically. So we have to order these somehow. So if we look inside of the getting started file, I have a key here called order 1. And that's how we can rearrange the order of these things. So if I change this to like order 10, we're going to find that this is at the bottom. And there it is. It's the last item there. Now you'll notice it's not chapter 10, and I'll show you how I accomplish that later. Order is different. It's just kind of 0 all the way up to infinity is how I modeled that. But for now, let's put that back. And let's just kind of get an understanding that we have a bunch of files, and these files, the URL maps to the file. That's another important thing. It just makes it a lot easier to find it. I know that if I look inside of app content, pages, docs, Rails, environment variables, I'm going to find what I'm looking for. This is really important if you're working with a team, because you need to find this stuff, and you need to quickly know like how you can get into this thing. And if you're actually shipping a community website, you can use these paths to generate edit on GitHub links. That's what I did for fly.io in their docs. If you hit an edit button, it'll take you to the edit page for that, and then you can fix a typo and open a PR. And it's really a good way to just massively scale documentation to an entire community. I haven't gotten that far with TerminalWire yet, but as I get further into this and crank out more documentation, you can expect to see an edit on GitHub page similar to that. Okay, so I call these files and folders content. They all hang out inside of the pages directory. So I guess these are pages, not content. And then we have another folder here called models. So these are page models. And a page model just sits above pages, and it starts to add data to it. So let's look at the manual model. If we look at this, we have a manual. A manual has a bunch of pages. Whenever we order the pages, and that's the order key that I showed you earlier, if we change the order to 10, you can see that it would loop through all the pages that are passed into here. We fetch the order data. If there's no order key present, then we're just going to say infinity. So if the key's not there, then it's going to be at the bottom. And if there's a key there saying the order is 1, then it's going to be up top. All right, so once we have our pages and they're ordered by order, then we need chapters. And here we call pages, which calls all the children page and orders them. And then we're creating a chapter page per page within a chapter. So in other words, to kind of bring it back to something that's more concrete, back down in pages and docs, this Rails page is modeled by the manual page. So the title, the subtitle, and all that stuff, we can see that here in these keys. And there's certain things you can do like that. Like I can add a method on it if I want to check like, hey, if the status of this is planned, and then I can call a Boolean. And I'll show you what the manual view looks like, so we can see, get a sense of what this actually looks like when it's rendering. All right, I guess first a disclaimer. I think most people watching this are going to be using ERB. I'm using Flex, which I understand why a lot of people don't want to build websites this way. So that's totally fine. I completely get why people want to use ERB. Haml and Slim, not so much. I used to be in that camp, but when Flex came out, I don't really think there's a good reason to use Haml or Slim anymore. Flex is kind of like a more powerful version of those types of languages, since you're just programming in Ruby. I don't want to go too far down that path. I think the important thing is that once you're inside of a view template here, this should start looking like familiar HTML. I'm also using Tailwind, another thing that some people find offensive. I like it. That's fine. There's a lot of different ways to do it. So just wanted to get that out of the way so that you're not too distracted thinking that's a prerequisite for this, because it's not. You can use ERB and you can use vanilla CSS. All right, so the view template, that's the thing that's actually being rendered. And if we are wondering like, well, where's manual coming from? How's that kind of conjured from this view? You can see we create an instance of that. So we have our manual page model and we pass it the current page. So this is the HTML page. We pass it into the manual page model. And then we have access to all the different methods and stuff in that model. So if you recall, we have chapters. Whenever you click on that button, I want to take you to the first chapter so you can read it. So you can see here, this is very natural when I read it out. Manual.chapters.first, you know that is going to take you to the first chapter. So we can actually pass pages or page models into the page path, and it will generate the URL for that page or that page model. And we can see that all over the place. Here's another first chapter. If we go down to the table of contents, and I'll switch over here briefly for you so we can kind of get our bearings again. The table of contents are right here. We just loop through each chapter, and then of course we want to link to that. We want to show the title, we want to show the subtitle, and then we want to show the chapter number. So to kind of recap what's going on here, we have these pages. In this case, we have the manual view, and that's Rails. So we have the Rails page. The Rails page is encapsulated by the manual page model. And then we can do things with that manual page model from our template. I think this is analogous to, this is action view, this is like active record, and of course this is your underlying data. The other thing I should mention is that this data does live in a file system, which actually has a lot of benefits. So if you look at man get, and let me just pull that up. Ooh. All right, so I'll pull up a terminal right here. I always like to point this out. Git is just a stupid content tracker, and I actually think it's the best way to manage content. I think when people think about content management systems, they're probably thinking something like WordPress, where you're storing content in a database. But I actually think databases are terrible at tracking content because it's really hard to version. If you develop content, say in a staging or a development environment, how do you synchronize that data, if it lives in a database, into a production environment? It's very difficult to do that. But if you use Git, we just don't even think about it. We take for granted how easy it is to synchronize content that we create in Git with different environments. So you can actually build some really powerful editing workflows around this. You can use GitHub as your kind of content editing system if you need like a basic GUI on it that, say, developers are comfortable using to edit technical documentation. There's just so many benefits to using Git over a database. And of course, we all know that you could probably spend 20 years just trying to learn all the ins and outs of Gits, but it really is a powerful tool, and I just can't recommend it enough for managing files to manage content. You can also build tests around content, which is quite interesting. And I've done this in a few cases where I needed to ensure that there's like one H1 header in a page. So I wrote an RSpec test that said, hey, make sure there's only one H1 thing in here. And you can kind of automate your SEO audits. I don't cover that in here, but just take note of that. Maybe it's something I'll talk about a bit later. Okay, let's go back to our list here and make sure that I've covered all the things. We had the app content folder in Rails. The custom markdown one, I'm going to jump into that in a minute. We have covered front matter and templates, globbing and traversal. I'll just pull that up really quick on Sitepress. Actually, you know what? I have this in code, so let me just show you kind of where I do that with. I think that is the content view. Yeah, okay. So in a footer of a website, let me close this terminal here. So we have pricing, we have docs, and we have trust. This is like terms and all that stuff. And I'll show you what that looks like in the footer. All right, so trust, we have these in here. Let's look at, oops, I have that. That is the wrong title. Let's fix that right now. All right, we'll call this pricing. Okay, fantastic. All right, so I have a folder full of prices. It's in this glob. So this is just a URL glob. So give me all of the HTML pages inside of pricing. So I think one important point here is that you don't have to wrap all your pages in models. I just did that for a manual because a manual has many chapters. That's just something that you're going to want to model. And actually, if I look at a manual page view, you'll see manual page. Yeah. You do have now manual chapter. So in a book, if you're on chapter 3, there's going to be a next chapter, right? That's chapter 4. And then, of course, there's a previous chapter, chapter 2. So that's what I'm using to kind of render these buttons, these forwards and next buttons. You might want to do that with a blog, right? If you have a blog, it has many posts. You have a next post and a previous post. So this is just a kind of a good thing to keep in mind for models and why you would want models. But you wouldn't necessarily want to do this for all pages. And that's the whole point for the content view here. You just want to get a glob of pages and render those pages. So if we look inside of this component, we see up here, we have a menu and we're passing pages and we're just looping through those pages. And, again, give me the page URL for this page. It should be page path. So you can do all sorts of things with globs. It's just kind of dealing with files. And globs, again, are pretty handy for dealing with things like the trust folder. So you have about, privacy roadmap. And that's one of the reasons I made this. Originally, it was for globbing. Traversal is really just about give me the parent pages. So if we look in the manual page, we can see here I have page children. So we're saying, hey, I am the cover page. I'm the Rails thing. Give me all of my children pages. And that's really traversing a directory. So it's looking at, we have the Rails page and all the children of the Rails page are kind of hanging out inside of here. And then also, these are modeled as chapter. If we look inside of chapter, we can see page parent, and that gets us back to the manual. So if I'm in file system and I say, hey, give me my parent page, it would give me the Rails.html file. There is support for default documents. So if we have a page inside of Rails called index.html.erb or whatever, it will treat that as the parent, even though it's in the same level. So some folks want that index page that's supported. You could change it to default. If you've built websites, 15, 20 years ago, that was kind of how it was done for just HTML files. People still work that way, so I figured, hey, I'll support that in Sitepress. Makes a ton of sense to do that. So you can kind of choose. It's your preference. I prefer this approach, so that's how I model all that stuff. All right, of course, the traversal is actually pretty well documented on the Terminalware website. Covered page models. We'll get to headless. This one's a lot of fun. But before we jump into headless, let's get into custom markdown. All right, so we do have all this markdown, and let's go into getting started. So you can see we have these blocks, these code blocks, SH, and we want to show essentially a terminal, right? We want to show hey, here's a window, and you're typing these commands. And then we have a different block called Ruby. And if we look at how those are rendered, we'll go into getting started. You can see these kind of have this window. There's actually you can select the whole command. And then the code blocks are rendered a bit differently. They're not stuck inside of a window. All right, so where is that managed. So there's another plugin that, or not a plugin. Yeah, I guess it is. It's a Rails extension, Markdown-Rails. It's a gem. I actually took over maintaining that, and I used it so much in Sitepress where I just rolled it under the Sitepress GitHub org. But you can run it outside of Sitepress. So you'll see it creates a folder called app markdown, and then you have two different kinds of markdowns in there. There's application markdown. This is using Red Carpet. So if you're wondering, well, how are these, where did you get all the names for these callbacks? It's all just kind of using Red Carpet underneath it. But there are two different handlers for Markdown. You can add your own. So that's kind of cool. I found that whenever you're working with Markdown, there's actually, you usually end up with, you usually have two, maybe three, sometimes, even more different flavors of Markdown. In this case, I'm not rendering Markdown submitted by end users, but if I did, I might have like a dangerous Markdown or something that's parsing Markdown submitted by users that disables things like HTML tags, JavaScript, things like that. But then for my own content that I trust, I might use application Markdown and have some things in there like this rendering. But let's go into the block code because that's a callback. And just for fun, I'm going to comment this. Actually, I'll delete it so that we hit kind of the default. And then this is what I think is the coolest thing. If I refresh the page, it's what I didn't have to do that's awesome. I didn't have to restart Rails for it to pick up that new template handler logic from the application Markdown. So if I put that back and hit refresh, you can see it's going to render the Markdown SH Rail blocks code block through this Flex component. All this is doing is it's taking that code block and this does some parsing on it, and it parses it into something that I then pass to an instance of mockup code, and then it gets rendered. And then for all the other stuff, I'm saying, just do the default thing for now. For Ruby, I'll probably come back and override this. I have another project where I have Tailwind tokens working for Rouge code highlighting. You can see I'm also intercepting headers right here, and I'm adding anchor tags. So there's just a lot you can do with callbacks. I think one of my kind of favorite examples is whenever you have an image and Markdown, I think of those kind of as blocks. So you might see this YouTube URL and be like, well, what? A YouTube link is not an image. But I would say it kind of is, because whenever you want to embed a YouTube video, you probably want to show the actual iframe that the person can click on. And then they click on it, of course, and maybe it starts playing the YouTube video. So if we look down here, we can see that whenever the link has this URL in it, or if the host is YouTube, then we're going to render this iframe. Otherwise, just call super, which is just going to render an image tag. So you can do a lot with this. Any URL that you could have that you would embed, maybe it's embed, you could just drop it in here and it would show a visual representation of it, which it's an image. At the end of the day, you're looking at it. It looks like an image. You can just click on it and the video starts playing. And the cool thing is, of course, like I said, you can just refresh it and it picks up the changes right away. You don't have to reboot the server or register new template handlers. And if you want to add new template handlers, you would open this up, which is a config initializers markdown file. You could have your own extension. And in this case, if you created mymd, then you'd have like page.html.mymd in Rails. Now, if you do register a new handle, you do have to restart the server. But I think that's a small price to pay, given that if you make changes to application Markdown in this case, you don't have to restart. I do ship ERB Markdown. There's just a lot of people that want to throw herb tags inside of Markdown. I don't really work this way. I think this is a bit of an anti-pattern. I won't get into that here, but I think like if you do templating well, then you probably don't need this. But there are some cases, I even run into these where it's like, you know what, I do need ERB. It's just easy. So I have the ERB Markdown handler, and of course I have it registered as markurb. I don't recommend making all your files markurb. Where you run into problems with this is like if you're showing a code example of ERB in a code fence, then it tries to render that as ERB. So that's problematic. There are some workarounds, like you can do the double percentage, but it's just kind of weird. I won't get into that, but just know that that's available. And of course, like if you wanted to have a liquid handler, you could do that. It's very flexible, and you can just register these templates into your application very quickly. All right, so let's get into the headless part. This is something I kind of poke fun at for the what is the static website industrial complex that I call it. They'll sell you this idea of like, hey, throw your content in the static website generator. And let's say you throw a bunch of support content in there, such as like this manual, right? And then you realize, you know what, I need to access this content from a completely different context. And what they'll do is they'll give you some kind of like JSON API, and you're going to be calling it over HTTP. So you're going to end up in a situation where you have this HTTP call between your content website and whatever service it is. I get why they do it that way, but I don't prefer to do it that way. Since I just have, as I showed before, I have all these models that kind of represent the content. That lets me do that within my application within the same process very easily. And to illustrate that, I do have a terminal subcommand in here called manual. So in terminal wire, just to kind of show how flexible it is, I think this is overkill. I actually don't think you'd want to read the docs this way, but you can. So if you run terminal wire manual ls, we can list the documentation that we have. I got to make this bigger. So we see here, we loop through all of our manual pages, and then we're rendering a table here. So title, subtitle. So that's being pulled from all the same templates that were being rendered in my HTML. And of course I have a URL here, so you can open it, but just for fun, let's try reading the Rails documentation. There's a whole bunch of gems called TTY, and they have this markdown parser. So you can just pass this gem your markdown, and you can see, again, manual page. So we're getting the page, and we're saying, hey, give me the body of this page. The body, just so you know, is this is front matter, so that's all the metadata, and then the body is just all the content. So we don't want to render this per se, but we do want to render this, and it's markdown. So if we go back into that command, manual subcommand. All right, we're going to loop through the chapters. We do want to pull the chapter title, and then we want to take the body of the chapter, and we're going to render it as markdown. So let's read the Rails docs, and boom. So this is a very, very headless CMS, and there was absolutely no HTTP calls. There wasn't really even an API. It was just me calling into the models that I had already built for HTML, so that I could show them in my CLI, and I just pass them to the Markdown parser. The fun thing about this for me, whenever I set all this stuff up for the documentation, is that implementing this literally took 10 minutes. And then I was able to deploy it to terminal wire. That took another 3 minutes. So like by the time I was done deploying, I invested a total of 15 minutes of time to get this whole thing working, and to have it just immediately available in the CLI, so that end users could just immediately start accessing this. So there's kind of a lot of pieces at play there. We have the Sitepress page models, and then of course, just the way that terminal wire streams IO. It means that I didn't have to ship an API or a client. I could just do this. I could add a feature saying like, have a chapter flag. So maybe we could do something like that. That obviously won't work now. But there's just like so many cool things you can do whenever you start looking at your content as data. Another thing that I haven't done yet that I probably will do is whenever you're kind of inside the application, it's useful to pull support content in. So I might start tagging all these different things, like I'll have FAQs that are Rails, I'll have manuals that are Rails, all these things. And then I can start building these landing pages like Rails resources, and it would just grab all these different types of content. One other example I want to show is how I use content for pricing. So if we go into Enterprise, we can click on that and you can see all the features. These are just content pages. So if I pull up, let's see, pricing, Enterprise, let's get rid of this terminal window. Yeah, so you can see we just kind of, the prices talk to us. And then we have all the features listed out here. So it's just content. And then Pro is kind of where things get interesting. So I actually have Stripe prices in here. And this is so that people can buy a Terminal Wire Pro license. So if I go in here, we can see the price is $99 per month or $1,000 per year. So if we click in on that, you can see a buy license. And that's actually going to take me out to, I got to sign in before I can buy this. All right, let me get my sign-in code. Okay, and then we'll say terminalwire.com/terminal. All right, so this takes me to a Stripe page. And what's cool, this is the only integration I have. So in the development environment, I have this Stripe price. And then in the production environment, it's going to take me to the Stripe price. I'm able to do this because of models. I think I call these products. I haven't refactored the names to be the same yet. But if we look here at the Stripe price method in the model, you can see, hey, give me the Stripe price key, but then I want the Rails environment. So in my case, it's development right now, and that's what I get. I get the Stripe price development. It returns this price, and then I have a payment controller that it understands. Let's pull that up here. Distributions. No, licenses, verifications. Oh no, all right. There we go. So inside a developer license, we have a payments controller. And there's logic in here that creates a Stripe checkout session. And then you can see here, I'm actually grabbing the Stripe price from the product. That's a product page. And again, that's the model. And then I actually have a thing in the database called license. So this is kind of an active record model referencing a Sitepress model. And if we look inside of here, you can see we have, this is just an application record. Whenever you buy a license, I keep track of, is it Core, Pro, or Enterprise? And so I need to get access to that front matter data so I can have access to the price if there's checkout. And that's where I do this here. So here's the Sitepress page model, and then I get the tier, which is stored in the database, and that's Core, Pro, or Enterprise. And then I can return that page so that I can get the data off of that. So that's kind of another interesting benefit of Sitepress is you can kind of mix it in with your active record models. There's good reasons to do that. I think it's better like if you're a smaller company to do that. If you're bigger and you need things more decoupled, somebody might accidentally rename the pro page to like professional, and then all of a sudden this wouldn't find the product. So it's something to keep in mind. There's trade-offs. That's just kind of life. Everything has trade-offs. But whenever you're small and you want to keep things tightly integrated and tightly coupled, this is a great way to move fast. And it's kind of an example too of like a headless CMS in action. All right, let's go back to our list and kind of see if everything is covered there. Yeah. All right, and let's continue with the slides. So that's kind of the state of Sitepress as it exists now. And I'm going to kind of give you a taste of some ideas I've had. If you haven't figured it out by now, I'm obsessed with Flex, and I've even taken it as far as, well, maybe do something like SiteFlex. Instead of front matter, we're just calling this layout called article. We don't even have to have the layout key. And then we're creating an instance of it and we're passing it data, which is front matter. So between those parentheses and article, that's the front matter. That's the data that you're passing into this thing to instantiate the page. And then we have this block called hero, and we're accessing title in it. And you can kind of see where this is going. I think the benefit to Siteflex, if you've worked with Markdown in something like Middleman or just kind of any content management type system, you've probably run into situations where you need to have like different blocks, and there's just no great way of handling that. So an example of that is like if you put a landing page together, you have a hero block, and that needs to kind of look and feel a certain way, and it's really hard to model that in Markdown. And then you'll have maybe you'll have an awesome hero, and then below that you'll just have like kind of this long form Markdown. And that's what I'm trying to illustrate here. We can just drop the hero in there. It's not a big deal. We can pass it, whatever it is that we want. And then there's a Markdown block that it just takes Markdown, and it's going to kind of parse that and do everything. This would actually run. It's kind of crazy. Like this is valid Ruby. It would run, it would parse. I don't have it running yet, but there's in Flex this thing called kits, and that's really what inspired me to think of this idea. Is like, well, what if I took Flex kits and did something like this? That could be kind of cool. So that's been on my mind to deal with some kind of more advanced things. The other thing I've been thinking about is just the active model is really good. That code I was showing earlier that shows kind of a manual has many chapters, and then a chapter belongs to a manual. It'd be cool to just write that macro in kind of each of those and cut the amount of code that I had to show you down by, at least in half, probably even more than that. So it'd be cool to have scopes and relationships in page models. Another thing that would be very easy to do that I'm just going to do is if you kind of look in the internals of the renderer, I built Sitepress before this was possible. So I have to do kind of these weird things with controllers to get pages to render. That's all kind of hidden behind an API, but I want to get this working so that you can just say, hey, action view, I want you to render this object. It's a page object. And then it would look at that page and say, oh, this is an HTML page. It's Markdown. Okay, here's what I need to render. And maybe it can kind of pull a layout from that. So I want to get this working just so it's more intuitive on how to render a page. And then I realized building terminal wire that I always run into this problem like, well, how do I get the URL or path to a page? And it occurred to me, it's like, oh, well, actually Rails has URL helpers built into it. So I figured out how to tap into that during the terminal wire documentation build out to make this easier. So you'll be able to just pass either a page or a page model into the page URL or page path helper, and it'll get you the right URL or path depending on what it is that you're looking for. So that's the end of the talk. If you were all sitting in an audience, I would say like scan this QR code, but there are links. I'm on Blue Sky. You can follow me at bradgessler.com. Also on Twitter, X, whatever you call it, at Brad Gessler. I'm kind of split between the two. So hit me up on either of those. And then of course, there's sitepress.cc. If I glossed over something or, you want to figure out how to use this or read the documentation, it's all there. And then of course, terminal wire. That's what I'm working on now. If you need to add a command line application to your Rails app, maybe you're shipping some kind of developer tool and you want a way for people to generate API keys without having to like click through all this GUI stuff. Check it out for that, and then you can start adding commands to it. Or if you're running like, say, some kind of like healthcare startup or something like that, and you have internal tooling that's just a nightmare to manage, especially like to show evidence to an auditor who wants to like see, hey, is this person allowed access to their production environment? Did you log the business reason why? You can actually use terminal wire to deal with that. And you can have like a deploy command, and it would pop open a login window and the user's browser, and they would have to log in through like your company's central sign-on or single sign-on. And it could even ask like, hey, you need to type a business reason in for this. So those are the two main kind of things I'm chasing now with terminal wire is can you ship a CLI fast without an API and just rapidly iterate there? And of course, like internal tooling and just clean that up. So check it out, and I'll see you next time.